Relax and listen to the voice. The Brave Tin Soldier. There were once 25 tin soldiers who were all brothers. They had been made out of the same old tin spoon. They shouldered arms and looked straight before them and wore a splendid uniform, red and blue. The first thing in the world they ever heard were the words, "Tin soldiers," uttered by a little boy who clapped his hands with delight when the lid of the box in which they had lay was taken off. They were given him for a birthday present, and he stood at the table to set them up. The soldiers were all exactly alike, excepting one, who had only one leg. He had been left to the last, and then there was not enough of the melted tin to finish him, so they made him to stand firmly on one leg, and this caused him to be very remarkable. The table on which the tin soldier stood was covered with other playthings, but the most attractive to the eye was a pretty little paper castle. Through the small windows, the rooms could be seen. In front of the castle, a number of little trees surrounded a piece of looking-glass, which was intended to represent a transparent lake. Swans made of wax swam on the lake and were reflected in it. All of this was very pretty, but the prettiest of all was a tiny little lady who stood at the open door of the castle. She, also, was made of paper, and she wore a dress of clear muslin, with a narrow blue ribbon over her shoulders, just like a scarf. In front of these was a fixed and glittering tinsel rose, as large as her whole face. The little lady was a dancer, and she stretched out both of her arms and raised one of her legs so high that the tin soldier could not see it at all, and he thought that she, like himself, had only one leg. "That is the wife for me," he thought, "but she is too grand and lives in a castle, while I have only a box to live in. 25 of us all together. That is no place for her. Still, I must try and make her acquaintance." Then he laid himself at full length on the table behind a snuff-box that stood upon it, so that he could peep at the little delicate lady, who continued to stand on one leg without losing her balance. When evening came, the other tin soldiers were all placed in the box, and the people of the house went to bed. Then the playthings began to have their own games together, to pay visits, to have sham fights, and to give balls. The tin soldiers rattled in their box. They wanted to get out and join the amusements, but they could not open the lid. The nutcrackers played at leapfrog, and the pencil jumped about the table. There was such a noise that a canary woke up and began to talk, and in poetry, too. Only the tin soldier and the dancer remained in their places. She stood on tiptoe, with her legs stretched out, as firmly as he did on his one leg. He never took his eyes from her for a moment. The clock struck 12, and with a bounce, up sprang the lid of the snuff-box. But, instead of snuff, there jumped up a little black goblin, for the snuff-box was a toy puzzle.
"Tin soldier," said the goblin, "don't wish for what does not belong to you."
But the tin soldier pretended not to hear.
"Oh, very well. Wait till tomorrow, then," said the goblin.
When the children came in the next morning, they placed the tin soldier in the window. Now, whether it was the goblin who did it, or the draft, is not known, but the window flew open, and out fell the tin soldier, heels over head, from the 3rd story, into the street beneath. It was a terrible fall, for he came head downwards, his helmet and his bayonet stuck in between the flagstones, and his one leg up in the air. The servant maid and the little boy went downstairs directly to look for him, but he was nowhere to be seen, although once they nearly trod upon him. If he had called out, "Here I am," it would have been all right, but he was too proud to cry out for help while he were in uniform. Presently it began to rain, and the drops fell faster and faster until there was a heavy shower. When it was over, two boys happened to pass by, and one of them said,
"Look, there's a tin soldier. He ought to have a boat to sail in."
So they made a boat out of newspaper and placed the tin soldier in it and sent him sailing down the gutter, while the two boys ran the side of it and clapped their hands. Good gracious, what large waves arose in that gutter, and how fast the stream rolled on, for the rain had been very heavy. The paper boat rocked up and down and turned itself round sometimes so quickly that the tin soldier trembled, yet he remained firm. His countenance did not change. He looked straight before him and shouldered his musket. Suddenly the boat shot under a bridge which formed a part of a drain, and then it was as dark as in the tin soldier's box. "Where am I going now?" thought he. "This is the Black Goblin's fault, I'm sure. Ah, well, if the little lady were only here with me in the boat, I should not care for any darkness." Suddenly there appeared a great water rat who lived in the drain.
Have you a passport?"
asked the rat.
"Give it to me at once."
But the tin soldier remained silent and held his musket tighter than ever. The boat sailed on and the rat followed it. How he did gnash his teeth and cry out to the bits of wooden straw.
"Stop him! Stop him! He has not paid a toll, and has not shown his pass."
But the stream rushed on stronger and stronger. The tin soldier could already see daylight shining where the arch ended. And then he heard a roaring sound, quite terrible enough to frighten the bravest man. At the end of the tunnel, the drain fell into a large canal over a steep place, which made it as dangerous for him as a waterfall would be to us. He was too close to it to stop, so the boat rushed on, and the poor tin soldier could only hold himself as stiffly as possible, without moving an eyelid, to show that he was not afraid. The boat whirled around 3 or 4 times, and then filled with water to the very edge. Nothing could save it from sinking. He now stood up to his neck in water, while deeper and deeper sank the boat, and the paper became soft and loose with the wet, till at last the water closed over the soldier's head. He thought of the elegant little dancer whom he should never see again, and the words of the song sounded in his ears. "Farewell, warrior, ever brave, drifting onward to thy grave." Then the paper boat fell to pieces, and the soldier sank into the water, and immediately afterwards was swallowed up by a great fish. Oh, how dark it was inside of the fish! A great deal darker than in the tunnel, and much narrower too. But the tin soldier continued firm, and lay at full length, shouldering his musket. The fish swam to and fro, making the most wonderful movements, but at last he became quite still. After a while, a flash of lightning seemed to pass through him, and then the daylight approached, and a voice cried out,
"I declare, here is a tin soldier."
The fish had been caught, taken to the market, and sold to the cook, who took him into the kitchen and cut him open with a large knife. She picked up the soldier and held him by the waist between her finger and thumb, and carried him into the room. They were all anxious to see this wonderful soldier who had traveled about inside of a fish, but he was not at all proud. They placed him on the table, and how many curious things do happen in the world! There he was, in the very same room from the window of which he had fallen. There were the same children, the same playthings standing on the table, and the pretty castle with the elegant little dancer at the door. She still balanced herself on one leg and held up the other, so she was as firm as himself. It touched the tin soldier so much to see her that he almost wept 10 tears, but he kept them back. He only looked at her, and they both remained silent. Presently, one of the little boys took up the tin soldier and threw him into the stove. He had no reason for doing so, therefore it must have been the fault of the black goblin who lived in the snuff box. The flames lighted up the tin soldier as he stood. The heat was very terrible, but whether it proceeded from the real fire or from the fire of love, he could not tell. Then he could see that the bright colors were faded from his uniform, but whether they had been washed off during his journey or from the effects of his sorrow, no one could say. He looked at the little lady, and she looked at him. He felt himself melting away, but he still remained firm with his gun on his shoulder. Suddenly, the door of the room flew open, and the draft of air caught up the little dancer. She fluttered like a sylph right into the stove by the side of the tin soldier, and was instantly in flames and was gone. The tin soldier melted down into a lump, and the next morning, when the maidservant took the ashes out of the stove, she found him in the shape of a little tin heart. But of the little dancer, nothing remained but the tinsel rose, which was burnt black as cinder. The Wild Swans. Far away in the land to which the swallows fly when it's winter, dwelt a king who had 11 sons and 1 daughter named Eliza. The 11 brothers were princes, and each went to school with a star on his breast and a sword by his side. They wrote with diamond pencils on gold slates and learnt their lessons so quickly and read so easily that everyone might know that they were princes. Their sister Eliza sat on a little stool of plate glass and had a book full of pictures which had cost as much as half a kingdom. Oh, these children were indeed happy, but it was not to remain so always. Their father, who was king of the country, married a very wicked queen, who did not love the poor children at all. They knew this from the very first day after the wedding. In the palace there were great festivities, and the children played at receiving company, but instead of having, as usual, all the cakes and apples that were left, she gave them some sand in a teacup, and told them to pretend that it was cake. The week after, she sent little Eliza into the country to a peasant and his wife, and then she told the king so many untrue things about the young princes that he gave himself no more trouble respecting them.
Go out into the world and get your own living,
said the queen.
Fly like great birds who have no voice.
But she could not make them ugly as she wished, for they were turned into 11 beautiful wild swans. Then, with a strange cry, they flew through the windows of the palace, over the park, to the forest beyond. It was early morning when they passed the peasant's cottage, where their sister Eliza lay asleep in her room. They hovered over the roof, twisted their long necks and flapped their wings, but no one heard them or saw them, so they were at last obliged to fly away, high up into the clouds, and over the wide world they flew, until they came to a thick, dark wood, which stretched far away to the seashore. Poor little Eliza was alone in her room, playing with a green leaf, for she had no other playthings, and she pierced a hole through the leaf and looked through it at the sun. And it was as if she saw her brother's clear eyes, and when the warm sun shone on her cheeks, she thought of all the kisses they had given her. One day passed just like another. Sometimes the winds rustled through the leaves of the rose bush and would whisper to the roses, "Who can be more beautiful than you?" But the roses would shake their heads and say, "Eliza is." And when the old woman sat at the cottage door on Sunday and read her hymn book, the wind would flutter the leaves and say to the book, "Who can be more pious than you?" And then the hymn book would answer, "Eliza." And the roses in the hymn book told the real truth. At age 15, she returned home, but when the queen saw how beautiful she was, she became full of spite and hatred towards her. Willingly would she have turned her into a swan, just as her brothers, but she did not dare to do so yet, because the king wished to see his daughter. Early one morning, the queen went into the bathroom. It was built out of marble and had soft cushions trimmed with the most beautiful tapestry. She took 3 toads with her and kissed them, and said to one,
"When Eliza comes to the bath, seat yourself upon her head, that she may become as stupid as you are."
And then she said to another,
"Place yourself on her forehead, that she may become as ugly as you are, and that her father may not know her." "Rest on her heart,"
she whispered to the third.
"then she will have evil inclinations, and suffer in consequence."
So she put the toads into the clear water, and they turned green immediately. She next called Eliza and helped her to undress and get into the bath. As Eliza dipped her head under the water, one of the toads sat on her hair, a second on her forehead, and a third on her breast, but she did not seem to notice them, and when she rose out of the water, there were 3 red poppies floating upon it. Had not the creatures been venomous or been kissed by the witch, they would have been changed into red roses. At all events, they became flowers, because they had rested on Eliza's head and on her heart. She was too good and too innocent for witchcraft to have any power over her. When the wicked queen saw this, she rubbed her face with walnut juice, so that she was quite brown. Then she tangled her beautiful hair and smeared it with disgusting ointment, till it was quite impossible to recognize the beautiful Eliza. When her father saw her, he was much shocked, and declared she was not his daughter. No one but the watchdog and the swallows knew her, and they were only poor animals who could say nothing. Then poor Eliza wept, and thought of her 11 brothers, who were all away. Sorrowfully, she stole away from the palace, and walked, the whole day, over fields and moors, till she came to the great forest. She knew not in what direction to go, but she was so unhappy, and longed so for her brothers, who had been, like herself, driven out into the world, that she was determined to seek them. She had been but a short time in the wood when night came on, and she quite lost the path, so she laid herself down on the soft moss, offered up her evening prayer, and leaned her head against the stump of a tree. All nature was still, and the soft, mild air fanned her forehead. The light of hundreds of glowworms shone amidst the grass and the moss like green fire, and if she touched a twig with her hand, ever so slightly, the brilliant insects fell down around her like shooting stars. All night long she dreamt of her brothers. She and they were children again, playing together. She saw them writing with their diamond pencils on golden slates, while she looked at the beautiful picture book which had cost half a kingdom. They were not writing lines and letters, as they used to do, but descriptions of the noble deeds they had performed, and of all they had discovered and seen. In the picture book, too, everything was living. The birds sang, and the people came out of the book, and spoke to Eliza and her brothers, but, as the leaves turned over, they darted back again to their places, that all might be in order. When she awoke, the sun was high in the heavens, yet she could not see him, for the lofty trees spread their branches thickly over her head, but his beams were glancing through the leaves here and there like a golden mist. There was a sweet fragrance from the fresh green verdure, and the birds almost perched upon her shoulders. She heard water rippling from a number of springs, all flowing in a lake with golden sands. Bushes grew thickly round the lake, and at one spot an opening had been made by a deer, through which Eliza went down to the water. The lake was so clear that, had not the wind rustled the branches of the trees and the bushes so that they moved, they would have appeared as if painted in the depths of the lake, for every leaf was reflected in the water, whether it stood in the shade or in the sunshine. As soon as Eliza saw her own face, she was quite terrified at finding it so brown and ugly. But when she wetted her little hand and rubbed her eyes and forehead, the white skin gleamed forth once more, and after she had undressed and dipped herself in the fresh water, a more beautiful king's daughter could not have been found in the wide world. As soon as she had dressed herself again and braided her long hair, she went to the bubbling spring and drank some water out of the hollow of her hand. Then she wandered far into the forest, not knowing whither she went. She thought of her brothers and felt sure that God would not forsake her. It is God who makes the wild apples grow in the wood to satisfy the hunger, and he now led her to one of these trees, which was so loaded with fruit that the boughs bent beneath the weight. Here she held her noonday repast, placed props under the boughs, and then went into the gloomiest depths of the forest. It was so still that she could hear the sound of her own footsteps, as well as the rustling of every withered leaf which she crushed under her feet. Not a bird was to be seen, not a sunbeam could penetrate through the large, dark boughs of the trees. Their lofty trunks stood so close together that when she looked before her, it seemed as if she were enclosed within trellis work. Such solitude she had never known before. The night was very dark. Not a single glowworm glittered in the moss. Sorrowfully, she laid herself down to sleep, and after a while, it seemed to her as if the branches of the trees parted over her head, and that the mild eyes of angels looked down upon her from heaven. When she awoke in the morning, she knew not whether she had dreamt this, or if it had really been so. Then she continued her wandering, but she had not gone many steps forward when she met an old woman with berries in her basket, and she gave her a few to eat. Then Eliza asked her if she had not seen 11 princes riding through the forest.
"No,"
replied the old woman,
"but I saw yesterday 11 swans with gold crowns on their heads swimming on the river close by."
Then she led Eliza a little distance farther, to a sloping bank, and at the foot of it wound a little river. The trees on its banks stretched their long leafy branches across the water towards each other, and where the growth prevented them from meeting naturally, the roots had torn themselves away from the ground, so that the branches might mingle their foliage as they hung over the water. Eliza bade the old woman farewell, and walked by the flowing river until she reached the shore of the open sea, and there, before the young maiden's eyes, lay the glorious ocean, but not a sail appeared on its surface, not even a boat could be seen. How was she to go farther? She noticed how the countless pebbles on the seashore had been smoothed and rounded by the action of the water. Glass, iron, stones, everything that lay there mingled together, had taken its shape from the same power, and felt as smooth or even smoother than her own delicate hand.
"The water rolls on without weariness," she said, "till all that is hard becomes smooth. So will I be unwearied in my task. Thanks for your lessons, bright rolling waves. My heart tells me you will lead me to my dear brothers."
On the foam-covered seaweeds lay 11 white swan feathers, which she gathered up and placed together. Drops of water lay upon them. Whether they were dewdrops or tears, no one could say. Lonely as it was on the seashore, she did not observe it, for the ever-moving sea showed more changes in a few hours than the most varying lake could produce during a whole year. If a black, heavy cloud arose, it was as if the sea said, "I can look dark and angry too," and then the wind blew, and the waves turned to white foams as they rolled. When the wind slept, and the clouds glowed with the red sunlight, then the sea looked like a rose leaf. But however quiet its white glassy surface rested, there was still a motion on the shore, as its waves rose and fell like the breast of a sleeping child. When the sun was about to set, Eliza saw 11 white swans with golden crowns on their heads, flying towards the land, one behind the other, like a long white ribbon. Then Eliza went down the slope from the shore and hid herself behind the bushes. The swans alighted quite close to her and flapped their great white wings. As soon as the sun had disappeared under the water, the feathers of the swans fell off, and 11 beautiful princes, Eliza's brothers, stood near her. she uttered a loud cry, for, although they were very much changed, she knew them immediately. She sprang into their arms and called them each by name. Then, how happy the princes were at meeting their little sister again, for they recognized her, although she had grown so tall and beautiful. They laughed and they wept, and very soon understood how wickedly their mother had acted to them all. "We brothers," said the eldest, "fly about as wild swans, so long as the sun is in the sky, but as soon as it sinks behind the hills, we recover our human shape. Therefore must we always be near a resting place for our feet before sunset, for if we should be flying towards the clouds at the time we recovered our natural shape as men, we should sink deep into the sea. We do not dwell here, but in the land just as fair that lies beyond the ocean, which we have to cross for a long distance. There is no island in our passage upon which we could pass. The night, nothing but a little rock rising out of the sea, upon which we can scarcely stand with safety, even closely crowded together. If the sea is rough, the foam dashes over us, yet we thank God even for this rock. We have passed whole nights upon it, or we should never have reached our beloved fatherland, for our flight across the sea occupies 2 of the longest days in the year. We have permission to visit our home once in every year, and to remain 11 days, during which we fly across the forest to look once more at the palace where our father dwells, and where we were born, and at the church where our mother lies buried. Here it seems as if the very trees and bushes were related to us. The wild horses leap over the plains as we have seen them in our childhood. The charcoal burners sing the old songs to which we have danced as children. This is our fatherland, to which we are drawn by loving ties, and here we have found you, our dear little sister. 2 days longer we can remain here, and then we must fly away to a beautiful land which is not our home. And how can we take you with us? We have neither ship nor boat."
"How can I break this spell?"
said their sister, and then she talked about it nearly the whole night, only slumbering for a few hours. Eliza was awakened by the rustling of the swans' wings as they soared above. Her brothers were again changed to swans, and they flew in circles wider and wider till they were far away. But one of them, the youngest swan, remained behind and laid his head in his sister's lap while she stroked his wings, and they remained together the whole day. Towards evening the rest came back, and as the sun went down they resumed their natural form.
"Tomorrow," said one, "we shall fly away, not to return again till a whole year has passed. But we cannot leave you here. Have you courage to go with us? My arm is strong enough to carry you through the wood, and will not all our wings be strong enough to fly with you over the sea?" "Yes, take me with you," said Eliza.
Then they spent the whole night in weaving a net with a pliant willow and rushes. It was very large and strong. Eliza laid herself down on the net, and when the sun rose, and her brothers again became wild swans, they took up the net with their beaks, and flew up to the clouds with their dear sister, who still slept. The sunbeams fell on her face. Therefore, one of the swans soared over her head, so that his broad wings might shade her. They were far from the land when Eliza awoke. She thought she must still be dreaming. It seemed so strange to her to feel herself being carried so high in the air over the sea. By her side lay a branch full of beautiful ripe berries and a bundle of sweet roots. The youngest of her brothers had gathered them for her and placed them by her side. She smiled her thanks to him. She knew it was the same who had hovered over her to shade her with his wings. They were now so high that a large ship beneath them looked like a white seagull skimming the waves. A great cloud floating behind them appeared like a vast mountain, and upon it Eliza saw her own shadow and those of the 11 swans, looking gigantic in size. Altogether, it formed a more beautiful picture than she had ever seen, but as the sun rose higher and the clouds were left behind, the shadowy picture vanished away. Onward, the whole day they flew through the air like a winged arrow, yet more slowly than usual, for they had their sister to carry. The weather seemed inclined to be stormy, and Eliza watched the sinking sun with great anxiety, for the little rock in the ocean was not yet in sight. It appeared to her as if the swans were making great efforts with their wings. Alas, she was the cause of their not advancing more quickly. When the sun set, they would change to men, fall into the sea, and be drowned. It was then that she offered a prayer from her inmost heart, but still no appearance of the rock came. Dark clouds came nearer. The gusts of wind told of a coming storm, while from a thick, heavy mass of clouds the lightning burst forth, flash after flash. The sun had reached the edge of the sea, when the swans darted down so swiftly that Eliza's head trembled. She believed that they were falling, but they again soared onward. Presently she caught sight of the rock just below them, and by this time the sun was half hidden by the waves. The rock did not appear larger than a seal's head thrust out of the water. They sunk so rapidly that at the moment their feet touched the rock, it shone only like a star, and at last disappeared like the last spark in a piece of burnt paper. Then she saw her brothers standing closely round her with their arms linked together. There was but just room enough for them, and not the smallest space to spare. The sea dashed against the rock and covered them with spray. The heavens were lighted up with continual flashes, and peal after peal of thunder rolled. But the sister and brother sat holding each other's hands and singing hymns from which they had gained hope and courage. In the early dawn the air became calm and still, and at sunrise the swans flew away from the rock with Eliza. The sea was still rough, and from their high position in the air, the white foam on the dark green waves looked like millions of swans swimming on the water. As the sun rose higher, Eliza saw before her, floating on the air, a range of mountains with shining masses of ice on their summits. In the center rose a castle, apparently a mile long, with rows of columns rising one above the other, while around it palm trees waved and flowers bloomed as large as mill wheels. She asked if this was the land to which they were hastening. The swans shook their heads, for what she beheld were the beautiful ever-changing cloud palaces of the Fata Morgana, into which no mortal can enter. Eliza was still gazing at the scene when mountains, forests, and castles melted away, and 20 stately churches rose in their stead, with high towers and pointed Gothic windows. Eliza even fancied she could hear the tones of the organ, but it was the music of the murmuring sea which she had heard. As they drew nearer to the churches, they also changed into a fleet of ships, which seemed to be sailing beneath her, but as she looked again, she found it was only a sea mist gliding over the ocean. So there continued to pass before her eyes a constant change of scene, till at last she saw the real land to which they were bound, with its blue mountains, its cedar forests, and its cities and palaces. Long before the sun went down, she sat on a rock in front of a large cave, on the floor of which the overgrown yet delicate green creeping plants looked like an embroidered carpet.
"Now, we shall expect to hear what you dream of tonight,"
said the youngest brother, as he showed his sister to her bedroom.
"Heaven grant that I may dream how to save you,"
she replied, and this thought took such hold upon her mind that she prayed earnestly to God for help, and even in her sleep she continued to pray. Then it appeared to her as if she were flying high in the air towards the cloudy palace of the Fata Morgana, and a fairy came out to meet her, radiant and beautiful in appearance, and yet very much like the old woman who had given her berries in the wood, and who had told her of the swans with golden crowns on their heads.
"Your brothers can be released," said she, "if you have only courage and perseverance. True, water is softer than your own delicate hands, and yet it polishes stones into shapes. It feels no pain as your fingers would feel. It has no soul, and cannot suffer such agony and torment as you will have to endure. Do you see the stinging nettle which I hold in my hand? Quantities of the same sort grow round the cave in which you sleep, but none will be of any use to you unless they grow upon the graves in a churchyard. These you must gather, even while they burn blisters on your hands. Break them into pieces with your hands and feet, and they will become flax, from which you must spin and weave 11 coats with long sleeves. If these are then thrown over the 11 swans, the spell will be broken. But remember that from the moment you commence your task until it is finished, even should it occupy years of your life, you must not speak. The first word you utter will pierce through the hearts of your brothers like a deadly dagger. Their lives hang upon your tongue. Please remember all I have told you."
And as she finished speaking, she touched her hand lightly with the nettle, and a pain as of burning fire awoke Eliza. It was broad daylight, and close by where she had been sleeping lay a nettle like the one she had seen in her dream. She fell on her knees and offered her thanks to God. Then she went forth from the cave to begin her work with her delicate hands. She groped in amongst the ugly nettles, which burnt great blisters on her hands and arms, but she determined to bear it gladly if she could only release her dear brothers. So she bruised the nettles with her bare feet and spun the flax. At sunset, her brothers returned and were very much frightened when they found her dumb. They believed it to be some new sorcery of their wicked stepmother. But when they saw her hands, they understood what she was doing on their behalf, and the youngest brother wept, and where his tears fell, the pain ceased, and the burning blisters vanished. She kept to her work all night, for she could not rest till she had released her dear brothers. During the whole of the following day, while her brothers were absent, she sat in solitude, but never before had the time flown by so quickly. One coat was already finished, and she had begun the second, when she heard the huntsman's horn, and was struck with fear. The sound came nearer and nearer. She heard the dogs barking, and fled with terror into the cave. She hastily bound together the nettles that she had gathered into a bundle and sat upon them. Immediately a great dog came bounding towards her out of the ravine, and then another, and they barked loudly and ran back, and then came again. In a very few minutes all the huntsmen stood before the cave, and the handsomest of them was the king of the country. He advanced towards her, for he had never seen a more beautiful maiden. "How did you come here, my sweet child?" he asked. But Eliza shook her head. She dared not speak at the cost of her brothers' lives, and she hid her hands under her apron so that the king might not see how she must be suffering. "Come with me," he said. "Here you cannot remain. If you are as good as you are beautiful, I will dress you in silk and velvet. I will place a golden crown upon your head, and you shall dwell and rule and make your home in my richest castle." Then he lifted her on his horse. She wept and wrung her hands, but the king said, "I wish only for your happiness. A time will come when you will thank me for this." And then he galloped away over the mountains, holding her before him on his horse, and the hunters followed behind them. As the sun went down, they approached a fair royal city with churches and cupolas. On arriving at the castle, the king led her into the marble halls, where large fountains played and where the walls and the ceilings were covered with rich paintings. But she had no eyes for all of these glorious sights. She could only mourn and weep. Patiently, she allowed the women to array her in royal robes, to weave pearls into her hair, and draw soft gloves over her blistered fingers. As she stood there before them in all her rich dress, she looked so dazzlingly beautiful that the court bowed low in her presence. Then the king declared his intention of making her his bride, but the archbishop shook his head and whispered that the fair young maiden was only a witch who had blinded the king's eyes and bewitched his heart. But the king would not listen to this. He ordered the music to sound, the daintiest dishes to be served, and the loveliest maidens to dance. Afterwards, he led her through fragrant gardens and lofty halls, but not a smile appeared on her lips or sparkled in her eyes. She looked the very picture of grief. Then the king opened the door of a little chamber in which she was to sleep. It was adorned with rich green tapestry and resembled the cave in which he had found her. On the floor lay the bundle of flax which she had spun from the nettles, and under the ceiling hung the coat that she had made. These things had been brought away from the cave as curiosities by one of the huntsmen. "Here you can dream yourself back again in the old home in the cave," said the king. "Here is the work with which you employed yourself. It will amuse you now, in the midst of all of its splendor, to think of that time." When Eliza saw all these things which lay so near to her heart, a smile played around her mouth, and the crimson blood rushed to her cheeks. She thought of her brothers, and their release made her so joyful that she kissed the king's hand. Then he pressed her to his heart. Very soon the joyous church bells announced the marriage feast, and that the beautiful dumb girl out of the wood was to be made the queen of the country. Then the archbishop whispered wicked words in the king's ear, but they did not sink into his heart. The marriage was still to take place, and the archbishop himself had to place the crown on the bride's head. In his wicked spite, he pressed the narrow circlet so tightly on her forehead that it caused her pain, but a heavier weight encircled her heart, sorrow for her brothers. She felt not bodily pain. Her mouth was closed. A single word would cost the lives of her brothers. But she loved the kind, handsome king, who did everything to make her happy. More and more each day, she loved him with all of her heart, and her eyes beamed with the love that she dared not to speak. Oh, if she only had been able to confide in him and tell him of her grief. But dumb she must remain until her task was finished. Therefore, at night, she crept away into her little chamber, which had been decked out to look like the cave, and quickly wove one coat after another. But when she began the seventh, she found that she had no more flax. She knew that the nettles she wanted to use grew in the churchyard, and that she must pluck them herself. How should she get out there?
"Oh, what is the pain in my fingers to the torment which my heart endures?"
said she.
"I must venture. I shall not be denied help from heaven."
Then, with a trembling heart, as if she were about to perform a wicked deed, she crept into the garden in the broad moonlight, and passed through the narrow walks and the deserted streets, till she reached the churchyard. Then she saw on one of the broad tombstones a group of ghouls. These hideous creatures took off their rags as if they intended to bathe, and then clawing open the fresh graves with their long, skinny fingers, pulled out the dead bodies and ate the flesh. Eliza had to pass close by them, and they fixed their wicked glances upon her, but she prayed silently, gathering the burning nettles, and carried them home with her to the castle. One person only had seen her, and that was the archbishop. He was awake while everybody was asleep. Now he thought that his opinion was evidently correct. All was not right with the queen. She was a witch, and had bewitched the king and all the people. Secretly he told the king what he had seen and what he feared. and as the hard words came from his tongue, the carved images of the saints shook their heads as if they would say, "It's not so. Eliza is innocent." But the Archbishop interpreted it in another way. He believed that they witnessed against her and were shaking their heads at her wickedness. 2 large tears rolled down the king's cheeks, and he went home with doubt in his heart, and at night he pretended to sleep, but there came no real sleep to his eyes, for he saw Eliza get up every night and disappear into her own chamber. From day to day his brow became darker, and Eliza saw it and did not understand the reason, but it alarmed her and made her heart tremble for her brothers. Her hot tears glittered like pearls on the regal velvet and diamonds, while all who saw her were wishing they could be queens. In the meantime, she had almost finished her task. Only 1 coat of mail was wanting, but she had no flax left, and not 1 single nettle. Once more only, and for the last time, must she venture to the churchyard and pluck a few handfuls. She thought with terror of the solitary walk and the horrible ghouls, but her will was firm, as well as her trust in Providence. Eliza went, and the king and the archbishop followed her. They saw her vanish through the wicket gate into the churchyard, and when they came nearer, they saw the ghouls sitting on the tombstone, as Eliza had seen them, and the king turned away his head, for he thought she was with them, she whose head had rested on his breast that very evening. "The people must condemn her," said he, and she was very quickly condemned by everyone to suffer death by fire. Away from the gorgeous regal halls was she led to a dark, dreary cell, where the wind whistled through the iron bars. Instead of the velvet and silk dresses, they gave her the coats of mail which she had woven to cover her, and the bundles of nettles for a pillow. But nothing that they could have given her would have pleased her more. She continued her task with joy, and prayed for help, while the street boys sang jeering songs about her, and not a soul comforted her with a kind word. Towards evening, she heard at the grating the flutter of a swan's wing. It was her youngest brother. He had found his sister, and she sobbed for joy, although she knew that very likely this would be the last night she would have to live. But still, she could hope, for her task was almost finished, and her brothers were come. Then the archbishop arrived to be with her during her last hours, as he had promised the king, but she shook her head and begged him, by looks and gestures, not to stay, for in this night she knew she must finish her task. Otherwise, all her pain and tears and sleepless nights would have been suffered in vain. The archbishop withdrew, uttering bitter words against her, but poor Eliza knew that she was innocent, and diligently continued her work. The little mice ran about the floor. They dragged the nettles to her feet, to help as well as they could, and the thrush sat outside on the grating of a window, and sang to her the whole night long, as sweetly as possible, to keep up her spirits. It was still twilight, and at least an hour before sunrise, when the 11 brothers stood at the castle gate, and demanded to be brought before the king. They were told that it could not be. It was yet almost night, and as the king slept, they dared not disturb him. They threatened and they entreated. Then the guard appeared, and then the king himself, inquiring what all the noise meant. At this moment the sun rose. The 11 brothers were seen no more, but 11 wild swans flew away over the castle. And now all the people came streaming forth from the gates of the city to see the witch burnt. An old horse drew the cart on which she sat. They had dressed her in a garment of coarse sackcloth. Her lovely hair hung loose on her shoulders. Her cheeks were deadly pale. Her lips moved silently, while her fingers still worked at the green flax. Even on the way to death, she would not give up her task. The 10 coats of mail lay at her feet. She was working hard at the 11th, while the mob jeered her and said,
"See the witch! See how she mutters! She has no hymn book in her hand. She sits there with her ugly sorcery. Let us tear her into 1,000 pieces.
And then they pressed towards her, and would have destroyed the coats of mail, but at the same moment 11 wild swans flew over her and alighted on the cart. Then they flapped their large wings, and the crowd drew on one side in alarm.
"It is a sign from heaven that she is innocent,"
whispered many of them, but they ventured not to say it out loud. As the executioner seized her by the hand to lift her out of the cart, she hastily threw the 11 coats of mail over the swans, and they immediately became 11 handsome princes. But the youngest had a swan's wing instead of an arm, for she had not been able to finish the last sleeve of the coat.
"Now I may speak,"
she exclaimed.
"I am innocent."
Then the people who saw what happened bowed to her as before a saint, but she sank lifeless in her brother's arms, overcome with suspense, anguish, and pain. "Yes, she is innocent," said the eldest brother, and then he related all that had taken place, and while he spoke, there rose in the air a fragrance as from millions of roses. Every piece of faggot in the pile had taken root, and threw out branches, and appeared a thick hedge, large and high, covered with roses, while above all bloomed a white and shining flower that glittered like a star. This flower the king plucked and placed in Eliza's bosom when she awoke from her swoon with peace and happiness in her heart. And all the church bells rang of themselves, and the birds came in great troops, and the marriage procession returned to the castle, such as no king had ever before seen. A Rose from Homer's Grave. All the songs of the East speak of the love of the nightingale for the rose in a silent, starlit night. The winged songster serenades the fragrant flowers. Not far from Smyrna, where the merchant drives his loaded camels, proudly arching their long necks as they journey beneath the lofty pines over the holy ground, I saw a hedge of roses. The turtle-dove flew among the branches of the tall trees, and as the sunbeams fell upon her wings, they glistened as if they were mother of pearl. On the rose bush grew a flower, more beautiful than them all, and to her the nightingale sung of his woes, but the rose remained silent. Not even a dewdrop lay like the tear of sympathy on her leaves. At last she bowed her head over a heap of stones and said,
"Here rests the greatest singer in the world. Over his tomb will I spread my fragrance, and on it I will let my leaves fall when the storm scatters them. He who sung of Troy became earth, and from that earth I have sprung. I, a rose from the grave of Homer, am too lofty to bloom for a nightingale."
Then the nightingale sung himself to death. A camel driver came by, with his loaded camels and his black slaves. His little son found the dead bird, and buried the lovely songster in the grave of the great Homer, while the rose trembled in the wind. The evening came, and the rose wrapped her leaves more closely round her, and dreamed, and this was her dream. It was a fair, sunshiny day. A crowd of strangers drew near, who had undertaken a pilgrimage to the grave of Homer. Among the strangers was a minstrel from the north, the home of the clouds and the brilliant lights of the aurora borealis. He plucked the rose and placed it in a book, and carried it away into a distant part of the world, his fatherland. The rose faded with grief, and lay between the leaves of a book, which he opened in his own home, saying, "Here is a rose from the grave of Homer." Then the flower awoke from her dream, and trembled in the wind. A drop of dew fell from the leaves upon the singer's grave. The sun rose, and the flower bloomed more beautiful than ever. The day was hot, and she was still in her own warm Asia. Then footsteps approached. Strangers, such as the rose had seen in her dream, came by, and among them was the poet from the north. He plucked the rose, pressed a kiss upon her fresh mouth, and carried her away to the home of the clouds and the northern lights. Like a mummy, the flower now rests in his Iliad, and, as in her dream, she hears him say as he opens the book, "Here is a rose from the grave of Homer." The Buckwheat. Very often, after a violent thunderstorm, a field of buckwheat appears blackened and singed, as if a flame of fire has passed over it. The country people say that this appearance is caused by lightning, but I will tell you what the sparrow says, and the sparrow heard it from an old willow tree which grew near a field of buckwheat, and is still there. It is a large, venerable tree, though a little crippled by age. The trunk has been split, and out of the crevice grass and brambles grow. The tree bends forward slightly, and the branches hang quite down to the ground, just like green hair. Corn grows in the surrounding fields, not only rye and barley, but oats, pretty oats that, when ripe, look like a number of little golden canary birds sitting on a bough. The corn has a smiling look, and the heaviest and richest ears bend their heads low, as if in pious humility. Once there was also a field of buckwheat, and this field was exactly opposite to Old Willow Tree. The buckwheat did not bend like the other grain, but erected its head proudly and stiffly on the stem. "I am as valuable as any other corn," said he, "and I am much handsomer. My flowers are as beautiful as the bloom of the apple blossom, and it is a pleasure to look at us. Do you know of anything prettier than we are, you old willow tree?" And the willow tree nodded his head, as if he would say, "Indeed I do." But the buckwheat spread itself out with pride and said, "Stupid tree, he's so old that grass grows out of his body." There arose a very terrible storm. All the field flowers folded their leaves together, or bowed their little heads, while the storm passed over them, but the buckwheat stood erect in its pride.
"And your head as we do,"
said the flowers. "I have no occasion to do so," replied the buckwheat. "Bend your head as we do," cried the ears of corn. "The angel of the storm is coming. His wings spread from the sky above to the earth beneath. He will strike you down before you can cry for mercy." "But I will not bend my head," said the buckwheat. "Close your flowers and bend your leaves," said the old willow tree. "Do not look at the lightning when the clouds burst. Even men cannot do that. In a flash of lightning, heaven opens, and we can look in, but the sight will strike even human beings blind. What then must happen to us, who only grow out of the earth, and are so inferior to them, if we venture to do so?" "Inferior indeed," said the buckwheat. "Now I intend to have a peep into heaven." Proudly and boldly he looked up, while the lightning flashed across the sky as if the whole world were in flames. When the dreadful storm had passed, the flowers and the corn raised their drooping heads in the pure still air, refreshed by the rain. But the buckwheat lay like a weed in the field, burnt to blackness by the lightning. The branches of the old willow tree rustled in the wind, and large water drops fell from his green leaves as if the old willow were weeping. Then the sparrows asked why he was weeping when all around him seemed so cheerful.
"See," they said, "how the sun shines, and the clouds float in the blue sky. Do you not smell the sweet perfume from a flower and bush? Wherefore do you weep, old willow tree?"
And then the willow told them of the haughty pride of the buckwheat, and of the punishment which followed in consequence. This is the story told me by the sparrows one evening when I begged them to relate some tale to me. And there we have it, faithful listeners, another episode of Hans Christian Andersen's Fairy Tales. This wraps up Volume 5, and from the looks of it, there's at least 15 to 3 million more episodes to go. We thank you again for being here with us. We thank you for your time. Please remember to subscribe, like the videos, share them with your friends, and help to promote us. Thank you again, and until next time, please remember to have sweet dreams.